You know what really grinds my gears? When people don't know how to critically think and they think AI can fix everything for them. Let's see if that's true. Now, if you're anything like me, you've seen it before, all the AI slop and AI garbage that's inaccurate. Well, a lot of people lately have been trying to use AI to bypass hiring a professional, whether that be a mechanic, a lawyer, some other person who's trained in whatever skill set they have. And, it's not always required to hire somebody. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, there's a time and a place where it makes a lot more sense to hire the professional who's trained to fix your problem right away and save you the money, save you the heartache of doing more damage on your own, and, just get the problem taken care of the first time. Now, this may come off as a rant video, and perhaps it is. I'm a little bit old school, so, challenge me this. AI certainly has a purpose and can be quite helpful. I have lots of friends who work with it every day in the industry, and they use it as the tool it's designed to be used as. And in that case, I have zero problems. However, a lot of people are relying on AI for the wrong reasons, and they're not understanding where AI gets its data or how inaccurate that data can actually be. And that's where I start to get nervous. I've seen it a lot on YouTube in the real world where people are relying on AI as if it can, generate its own data. And it's actually quite inaccurate, and really what it's doing is just pulling information from all these random sources on the internet. Kind of like Wikipedia, it's not a reliable resource. So, while it's good at certain things, and it can certainly be helpful, it's not the answer to everything. And I've seen this time and time again where, people go to it to give them an answer, and the answer ends up screwing up their engine or getting them hurt, or, something major happens. I'm gonna tell you a quick story about yesterday, and this is what prompted me to make this video today, is, I boarded a boat to diagnose a low power problem. And those of you guys who saw the video I posted yesterday, we obviously found the issue, which was that fuel filter. However, one of the owners was on the phone with me. I was trying to get a history. They were the ones operating the boat when it lost the power, so that's why I wanted to talk to him directly, because he experienced it. And he immediately jumped into telling me, well, AI says it's the turbo or the charge air cooler or one of the charge pipes. And that's fine and dandy. However, with that type of boat and that type of turbo, that would be thousands of dollars to replace or have rebuilt, not including the labor. So, do you want me to just blindly replace your turbo and, bill you for that, and then the problem still isn't fixed, and now I look like a crappy mechanic because I listen to you who listen to AI? You get the point. It's frustrating. So I actually had to argue with him a little bit, where I said, I prefer to start with the basics first, and it's really quick and easy to check a fuel filter, which is what we did. And sure enough, 5 minutes later, we replaced a couple, $10 fuel filters, and boom, the engine sprang to life. And so that's the difference between spending, $6 to $8 grand versus, maybe a couple $100 for my labor and travel, and a $10 filter. Alright, so since I'm filming this video on my phone, I'm going to pull out the Panasonic Toughbook. This thing lives in the truck, so it's normally on a mount. That's why I have the wood blocks. I don't feel like taking it all apart, and I don't have the keys to unlock it. So it's going to look a little funny today, but we're going to use this to get the AI. I'm going to use Gemini or ChatGPT or something, and we'll see if that can help us with our training engine. So the first prompts I'm going to give it is just seeing whether it can identify this engine and whether it can identify the title of this engine and show me a picture of what it should look like. So the first test, it actually passed pretty well. The pictures that I gave it, it was able to identify this engine as a 3YM30 right away. So yay, that's a pass. But me trying to look up what a 3YM30 looked like, it gave me a picture of a 3JH40, which is a completely different engine. And same goes for, I tried another prompt where, I asked it what a 3GM30F looked like, and it also gave me the same picture of the 3JH40, and those are very, very different engines. One is common rail. The 3JH40 is a common rail engine with a variety of electronics on it, and the 3GM30F, you guys have seen a couple of those in my video. They're very, very mechanical engines. So it's not able to identify it based on the title alone. It seems to be able to identify it if I provide it pictures. All right, so the next prompt I want to try is just a simple, procedure, like walk me through removing a manifold or something like that. So let's see how that goes. All right, so we've allowed our engine to cool for a couple hours, right? And they are dead on with that. You never want to open one of these caps. When our engine's hot, the cap could blow off. You could get some really serious burns. So AI did a good job with kind of the safety layout. The next thing we got to do, according to AI, is we got to drain the coolant. And this is something they're actually very accurate at. The coolant drain is down here. And I'll show you that in a second. And it does, in fact, use a 3mm Allen head, bit. So I'll, loosen that up, drain it into a pan, just like they say. And then we should be set to start removing, this stuff. All right, so the next step, we've got to disconnect the coolant hoses, as in plural. And we're having it instruct us to remove this, and there's only one hose. So I'm curious, what the second hose is that they're referring to. Maybe they're thinking about heater hoses, but that's part of our water pump assembly. So let's get this off. Not the easiest way to approach it, but we can certainly do it that way. Because remember, right now I'm a DIYer, so I'm not a mechanic. But I'm a DIYer with an impact gun. So, let's get this hose off. Ooh. Oh, it's coming, come on, there we go. Aha, success. Hoses disconnected. All right, what's our next step? It says, unbolt the thermostat housing cover, which requires 10mm sockets. So this would be the housing cover. And let's see if a 10mm, those aren't 10mm. Why, what around here is 10mm? That's 10mm. That's 10mm. Is that my thermostat housing? I don't know. I'm a do-it-yourselfer. AI, I think you got this wrong. So this is the part that's actually kind of funny. We just had the instructions to remove our housing bolts, and these are not 10mm, these are 12mm. It's at this point in the instructions where they start including pictures that are incorrect for this engine. So the next step, which tells me to extract the thermostat and pull the flange, it shows me a picture of a 3GM30F flange. And that doesn't apply to this engine. It's very different. So as we progress in these instructions, they're starting to mix up our 3YM30 with the 3GM30F. And the funny thing is, they still have the bolt sizes wrong. These are still 12mm bolts for this thermostat housing. And the flange they're referring to is the flange that's back here. And it's actually like a separate flange from the water pump. So the water pump comes off, and then there's this flange that houses, you know, it includes the bracket for the alternator, and it has the housing for the thermostat. But this is a 3GM30F engine, which is very different than our 3YM30. Okay, so as a DIYer, I'm a little confused. I'm not seeing any 10mm bolts, but you know, I think I know what the thermostat housing is. Let's take it apart and see what else we find. Alright, so we'll take these 12mm off. Well, there we go. There's our thermostat. And yay, there we go. So this is our thermostat housing. This is part of the base housing, but it's actually part of the water pump. This is actual part of the water pump casting. This is the actual, you know, housing cover for our thermostat. And so, you know, maybe I wasn't clear enough in my instructions. However, it's kind of interesting how AI is starting to mix up different Yanmars. I've now seen 2 separate Yanmars from this engine that I'm asking questions about, and I am very clear about what model engine this is. This is a 3YM30, and it's somehow mixing up a GM series and a JH series. And so as a DIYer, you know, halfway through this project, you know, you're going to be confused because it's telling you that there's more than one hose to it. If we're really going to count the base part of the housing, there's actually, you know, several more hoses, 3 more hoses. So that's not even accurate. So, you know, really kind of not clear instructions in terms of what I actually should be taking apart. And if I'm not that confident in how this engine comes apart, I'm gonna quickly find myself in a place where I don't know what I'm doing now, and the instructions are not helping me. Well, so far, I'm gonna give this little task an F. Where we started out solid, all the very generic information, you know, let the engine cool down, drain your coolant. That applies to every engine that you're going to touch. And that's good that they included it, because there really are people who would open up the cooling system when it's hot. So that's good that they're including that for safety. They did actually get the drain plug location and Allen head size correct. So I was like really excited to see that. But then shortly after that, that's when things started to fall apart. So, you know, if this is like your first time ever getting into an engine, you're quickly going to be overwhelmed. Not that this was a hard task. This is one of the easiest things to remove on this engine. It's right on top. It's just a couple of bolts and a hose. However, you know, like AI wasn't able to do that. They did, however, find a couple basic diagrams in the beginning, which was cool. However, those diagrams, they showed the drain cock, and then they didn't show like where the thermostat housing was. So, you know, on this engine, the thermostat housing happens to be right on top, but like on the Cummins over there, the thermostat housing is actually on the side of the engine. If you're facing the front of the engine, it's on the left side, and it doesn't look like a classic thermostat housing like you'd expect to see. So, you know, like in terms of that, it started struggling because it wants to be generic and cover it, but it doesn't have enough information to give you actual accurate data like your manual would. Okay, well, let's try prompt number 3. Let's see if I can diagnose a basic issue. I've seen lots of videos, excuse me, on this with the automotive industry, but let's see if I can diagnose a marine engine. Let's say this thing won't start, which is actually one of the jobs I have to go to tomorrow. The job tomorrow is actually a 3YM20, so the slightly smaller version of this, and it will not crank at all. In this case, this engine's obviously not hooked up to a battery, so we already know what the problem is, right? But let's feed those prompts into AI and see if it actually points towards either a dead battery, as if our battery was low voltage or 0 volts, or that it's not hooked up at all. All right, AI, can you tell me why this engine won't crank right now? We seem to be mixing up our engines again. That picture is a 3JH40, not a 3YM30, despite the label it's giving us. Alright, so AI is giving me 2 options. One is the engine will not crank or it only clicks. And the other option is it cranks but will not start. So we have a no crank, no start situation. So the first thing AI is telling me to check is that my shift lever is actually in neutral, because there might be a neutral safety switch that's keeping the system from being able to crank. That would be helpful if this engine actually had a neutral safety switch. The second thing it wants me to check is to check for voltage, but it doesn't tell me where to check for voltage. So am I checking voltage in my harness? Am I checking voltage at the starter? Remember, I'm a DIYer, not a mechanic. Let's ask AI where I should be checking for voltage. Alright, so AI actually does include a picture of our starter with an arrow pointing to the solenoid. And you can actually see the manifold in the picture, so yay, they finally got, you know, the right engine. And they do explain to find a clean ground, like the engine block, and to test both our, you know, main stud and the signal wire, which is that spade connector in the back, to see what we get. So, having no voltage, I fed it to AI saying I've got 0 voltage at both my main terminal and my signal post. And AI responded, check your battery switch, check the grounds, and check the main fuse on your starting battery. That's pretty accurate information. However, not everyone's going to have a fuse, so that's something to keep in mind. That it's not required by ABYC, however, it's not a bad idea. And so if you do have a fuse on your heavy cable, absolutely, you know, so it's starting to go down the right path of, okay, you don't even have voltage to your starter. And so it's encouraging you to look elsewhere that's not on the engine. So that's what I wanted to see, which is great. So at least that diagnostic is pretty straightforward. You know, that's a pretty simple one, but I just wanted to see what they'd come back with, and, you know, pretending that I just have no idea, like, what I'm looking at, what I'm doing, would it be able to find the right things? Now, it did kind of do a little bit of the same, you know, as the last kind of prompt test we did with it, where it started out and it continued to mix up a couple different Yanmar engines. So while it nailed the starter location and, you know, like what the solenoid and everything looks like, it actually suggested, you know, checking things like my decompression levers. And this engine doesn't have decompression levers. That's a 3GM30F, thing, or a 2GM20F, something like that. This engine doesn't have that. It also encouraged me to check, for a neutral safety switch issue, which this engine does not have. That's a JH, one of the newer JH Common Rail series things. And, it suggested some of the fuses in the harness and some of the relays on the engine, which this engine does not have. The JH series has. The relays it was suggesting, they were actually the JH series. So AI, for some reason, is having a really hard time, despite me being very clear that this is a 3YM30 engine, not a JH engine. It still seems to be mixing it up. It's also linking some YouTube videos, which is somewhat helpful. And I actually gave it another prompt off camera where I asked it about like a raw water pump, rebuilding, like what leaking water from the raw water pump would be, and starting issues with the Yanmar. And both of those videos were other sailors who managed to like make the repair, but they did it in a way that I would never ever recommend. And so I don't know that that's the greatest resource to go off of. You have to be very careful with YouTube because, anyone, including me, can post videos. And like the raw water pump, they were suggesting, they showed a YouTube video of a guy literally pulling the seals out with like a flathead screwdriver, and he was scoring up the pump housing. And you don't want to do that because you'll destroy the entire pump. And so that's, things like that are where you have to be careful because, fellow DIYers aren't necessarily going to do it properly. Will it work? Perhaps. However, you need to be really careful about where you're getting your information from. So, this was an interesting kind of experiment to see, what AI knows about kind of marine diesels and like where it would take me if I was truly a DIYer who was having a problem and didn't know even where to get started. Some of it is accurate, but a lot of it wasn't. And honestly, if I didn't know what I was doing, I would be wasting tons of time looking for these things that, AI is telling me are on my engine. I'd be looking for, like that pump housing that's on the GM series on this engine, stuff like that, where, I'm like wasting time and using the wrong tools and all kinds of stuff because AI told me to do that, potentially damaging my engine. Because, it's telling me, oh, you can take this metal tool to a bronze pump housing. No problem. Watch this YouTube video. So that's the concern that I'm having with the suggestions. And the reason why, if you're going to use AI, be very, very careful. Because, again, it's literally just pulling random information, trying to answer the question, but it doesn't think for itself. It's just pulling information on the internet. So I could literally post whatever I wanted on the internet, and AI would probably pull it, and perhaps suggest it to somebody else, and that could be a problem. It might even pull my YouTube video, which hopefully would help somebody actually fix an engine. But, like let's say I was really inaccurate or something. Well, they might follow that advice and screw up their engine. So, you can get into some deep, dark corners in terms of repairing really anything. Will it help me get started with a diagnosis? Yeah. On some of the more basic stuff, it was right on par. I think pretty much every YouTube channel has probably asked it, like, how do you diagnose a starter that's failing? Or, like an engine that won't start or something like that. However, you do kind of have to be somewhat familiar with what this engine has and doesn't have. Because, if it's telling you to check decompression levers or a neutral safety switch or certain things in the harness that the engine doesn't have, you're just going to go on a wild goose chase and never find it. So be careful with what you use that information for. And, you know, I'm glad I tested it out, because it's good to know, you know, my first impressions are in fact accurate. AI is not really that accurate when it comes to, you know, diagnosing and working on at least marine diesels. You know, maybe down the road I will experiment with a different engine. You know, maybe Yanmar's kind of an oddball one and AI just doesn't know that much about it. However, you know, Yanmar is one of the biggest marine manufacturers in the world. So I'm not really sure how it can't pull that much information, other than maybe that information is protected. So, you know, if you're going to go that route, just be really, really careful. So, am I afraid that AI might take my job? No, not anytime soon. Even if they could answer the questions correctly, they aren't going to be turning wrenches. Although, you know, if they wanted to, they'd certainly be allowed to. The older I get, the harder it gets for me and every other mechanic. So, you know, keep working on it and you might get there. Anyways, I hope you guys learned something. Take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, you know, repairing anything, whether it's an engine or another device, you know, requires a level of critical thinking that I feel like, you know, we are losing as time goes by. And so, you know, educate yourself on the components on your own engine. And, you know, that way, like, AI can help you because you'll know what you have and don't have. And, you know, but don't just blindly follow it, you know, word for word. It is not the gospel, and you can get into trouble. Lots of people have gotten in trouble. The gentleman I was trying to help yesterday, he almost got into trouble. Had I just blindly followed what he was saying, that would have been a very, very pricey, you know, day, and it wouldn't have actually fixed the problem, and nobody wants that. So, you know, I like implore you to look a little deeper, check your resources. You know, this probably dates me a little bit, but back in the day when we were using encyclopedias, and then, you know, the internet kind of introduced like Wikipedia and stuff, it was kind of the same lesson where, you know, I remember my teacher being like, you're not allowed to use that as a resource because anyone can add anything and nothing's fact checked. It's the same with AI. You know, there's tons of AI slop. I know we're all tired of it, especially on YouTube. And so, you know, like, you want to be careful of where you get your information. And that applies to everything, not just, you know, AI. But, you know, I hope you're able to learn from this and continue fixing your own engines. And I will plan on seeing you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.